We live on a planet full of extremes. Drought, cold, tempest. But for as long as humans have been keeping record of these weather extremes, none has been more infamous than the record high temperature. Earth's most iconic weather extreme is the legendary 58 degrees Celsius, 136.4 Fahrenheit reading recorded on September 13, 1922. For nearly a century, the title of hottest temperature ever recorded has belonged to Al-Azizia, Libya, recorded in an Italian military fort in a time when colonial warfare was as hot as the temperature. Few have questioned the validity of this record until now.
It's fun to look at extremes.
These out-of-the-ordinary events can happen.
There are certainly a lot of questions.
What actually happened there?
It never occurred to me to question the record.
Here's someone looking at something we all take for granted.
It is one of the longest-standing world records there is.
Al-Azizia is set on a semi-arid plain in northern Libya, approximately 25 miles from the Mediterranean Sea. Although there is no doubt this area is one of the warmest in the world, Chris Burt, a weather extremes expert and New York Times best-selling author, decided to take a closer look at this controversial extreme.
I've had an interest in weather really since I was 5 or 6 years old. I still have my weather diary I kept.
As a child, Chris regularly visited the offices of Weatherwise magazine, where his mentor, David Ludlam, worked as editor and shared his fascination of weather with Chris.
He had laboriously gone through all of the weather extremes for about 200 or 300 cities across the United States, and for the first time compiled a comprehensive extreme record. I decided to try to do something like that book, using my experience as a photo editor and publisher to make it into a really beautiful, extravagant book.
Chris's book, Extreme Weather, a guide and record book, was the first book of its kind to receive a full-page review in the New York Times, earning it a spot on the bestsellers list.
The book brought me to the attention of the weather website, Weather Underground.
Working with Weather Underground, Chris has made the transition from book publisher to blog publisher. His blog about extreme weather is now one of the most popular on wonderground.com.
On October 14, 2010, I published a blog on Weather Underground titled Questions Concerning the Hottest Temperature at Al-Azizia, Libya.
This temperature, recorded in Al-Azizia on September 13, 1922, was a sweltering 58 degrees Celsius.
The reason I wrote that blog, I received this email from my friend Max dissing this record, saying, "It's a bunch of BS, this record. It can't possibly. I laugh like a baby," he'd say, which of course has been reproduced in every almanac, encyclopedia for the last 90 years. And so I just assumed it was always official, had been investigated. I initially went into it believing that the record was probably accurate. And when Max started sending me these sarcastic emails, I began researching it in more detail, and the more I looked into it, the worse the record began to look. I began communication directly with Khalid Ibrahim El Fadli, who was the director of the Libyan National Meteorological Center in Tripoli.
El Fadli, official caretaker of the Libyan Meteorological Archives, worked closely with Chris, providing information directly from the archival records. Without El Fadli's painstaking attention to detail and advice from Libya, Chris may never have gained the scientific information necessary to move forward with this historic investigation.
El Fadli was very forthcoming. It sent me reams of data on not just Al-Azizia, but all the surrounding sites that were in operation at that time. I began to get kind of excited about it. I thought, I can't believe for 90 years that nobody has actually looked hard at this very significant planetary record. El-Fadli and I were batting ideas back and forth. I told him I was going to write this blog.
Chris used this blog to pose a challenge to the accuracy of meteorology's most famous record.
It's fun to look at extremes. And so that's an extreme. That's the hottest temperature ever. And yet here's a discussion, a very scientifically based discussion, looking at that particular issue.
Any sort of good science uses a peer-reviewed type of process. You have multiple eyes looking at the puzzle to try and get the best picture.
Alone, Chris and El-Fadli could take no official action regarding the validity of the record. They would need support of their peers in the World Meteorological Organization. The World Meteorological Organization, or WMO, is a United Nations organization that unifies the world's meteorological agencies.
That is the only avenue to overturn this record, because they are the official world arbitrators on this subject.
Getting the WMO involved in the investigation would require an abundance of evidence against the Al-Azizia record. Evidence that 90 years later may be forever lost to time.
You have to look into a tremendous number of details that are not necessarily often available.
It's like trying to prove a murder that's 90 years old. You know, the forensic evidence is probably long gone.
It is possible that that part of the world experienced quite warm temperatures in the 1920s.
At this time, Al-Azizia was under Italian control and was an important strategic position for the Italian military, as several trade routes from the sea to the mountains passed through here.
This is a photograph of Al-Azizia from the Italian colonial fort. At this time, there was a rebellion against the Italians, and they had just destroyed the railway from Tripoli connecting to the fort. So the soldiers at the fort were isolated. You can imagine keeping accurate weather data was probably one of the last things on their mind.
That weather data was in the care of Amilcare Fantoli. Fantoli was a member of the Italian military and a Renaissance man. He organized the first meteorological service in Libya, then called Tripolitania. Fantoli
First published the data from Al-Azizia in a report in 1923. He was a little suspicious of the record himself. One of the most interesting sections in the document was a description of the instrument shelter that the thermometer at Al-Azizia was located. He said it was set on a tar-covered concrete surface in the square of the fort. Well, that immediately is a red flag to anybody who knows about exposure of instruments.
Basic criteria for taking good temperature measurements is you take it over a natural surface, 1.5 meters above the ground. You take it out of direct sunlight and in a well-ventilated area.
If that instrument was above a black tar type of surface, that would influence the temperature.
They could get radiation energy welling up from the ground to affect the temperature measurements.
It would make the whole record elevated, because they probably just didn't tar it over on this one day. I mean, it was tarred there for an extended period of time.
The Al-Azizia weather station changed locations in the years between 1913 and 1984, which according to Chris may also have contributed to higher temperature readings in the early 1920s.
The first site from 1913 to 1920, the hottest temperature measured was 119 degrees. The second site between 1920 and 1926, which was the site up on the hill where 136 degrees was recorded in 1922. The third site from 1927 to 1984, the hottest temperature measured was 122 degrees. We can see there was a recurring pattern of anomalous temperatures during that period of time when the instruments were housed at the fort.
Not only did this site over blacktop produce temperatures at odds with the preceding and following locations, But on that day in 1922, when the Al Azizia weather station reached 136.4 degrees Fahrenheit, its reading was inconsistent with the surrounding Libya weather stations as well.
No other site in Libya that day recorded a temperature over 117 Fahrenheit, which compared to Al Azizia at 136 plus degrees Fahrenheit is a huge anomaly. They were more or less in sync with each other until September the 12th, when all of a sudden the Azizia temperature became 15 degrees warmer than all the other sites.
If normally the stations are all relatively similar, and now there's a shift for the whole month, that's extremely unusual. And you could calculate the probability of that happening by natural chance, and I would imagine that would be extremely low.
Anytime you have an outlier, sort of automatically get some extra scrutiny.
This sudden rise in temperature raised more questions for Chris than it answered. As he and El Fadli continued to investigate, they learned the official thermometer normally used at the site had at some point been replaced by a common household 6 Bellani thermometer.
A 6 Bellani is a self-registering maximum minimum thermometer. It consists of a U-shaped tube of glass with little slides inside of the tubes.
These slides are pushed up by the mercury within the tubes. As the heat rises, the maximum slide rises to mark the highest temperature and remains at that position even after the temperature decreases. As the mercury lowers on the maximum side, it rises on the minimum side. The slide on the minimum side then remains at the lowest temperature reading so that both the high and low temperatures can be observed at a later time.
It is important to note that the length of these slides inside the 6 Bellanis were about 7 to 8 degrees centigrade in length inside of the tube. It became really increasingly obvious that something was definitely wrong with this record.
The WMO, I think, right from the beginning was interested in pursuing this investigation with perhaps some hesitation. Their real mission is to validate new records, not go back and rehash old history.
However, Chris had a valuable ally in El Fadli. With firm doubts about the Libyan record, Chris asked El Fadli if Libya itself officially recognized the record. The answer he received was unexpected.
He said, no, we don't recognize it. And I thought that's interesting.
Chris forwarded El Fadli's answer to the WMO committee. In February 2011, prompted by the evidence which Chris and El Fadli brought to light, the WMO began an official investigation into the Al Azizia record. This marked the first time the WMO has ever reviewed an historically accepted record.
Something happened on September 11th at Al Azizia that caused this sudden change in relationship with the other sites.
Working closely with Chris from Libya, El Fadli searched the Libyan archives for an explanation and found the original handwritten record from 1922.
One guy had very neat cursive script, and then this rather sloppy handwriting came in, obviously written in by somebody different. And also the person beginning on the 12th didn't know which column to write the temperatures in. This began to raise a question of the quality of the observer.
The maximum temperature at Al Azizia jumped approximately 7 degrees Celsius compared to the other sites with the change in observer.
Well, that's a coincidence, isn't it? That the slide inside of the 6 Bellani thermometer is 7 to 8 degrees long. The investigation came to the conclusion that the observer was reading the top of the slide instead of the bottom of the slide.
If he really accidentally looked at the top of that little magnetic bar, that explains a lot right there.
Then the Libyan revolution occurred in February of 2011, and we suddenly lost contact with El Fadli. He did all the hard work on this investigation, digging up these records, and we consequently put the investigation on hold. It was really like a balloon collapsing.
Throughout the Libyan revolution, Chris and the other members of the WMO committee reached out to El Fadli with no response. With death tolls rising to over 20,000 and large areas of Tripoli in ruins, the investigation was not the only thing at stake. The violence in Libya continued for 6 months with no word from El Fadli until Chris and the rest of the committee began to fear the worst. In August 2011, El Fadli was finally able to make contact.
And he was able to contact us and say, I'm okay, but the Met office has been trashed and burned.
Fortunately, although the Libyan Meteorological Office was damaged, all of the records survived.
So we were able to resume the investigation at that time. It is like a criminal investigation in some way. What was mostly circumstantial evidence, when you put it all together, becomes overwhelming evidence.
The evidence was bringing to light a clear picture of what happened that day. But the committee needed evidence beyond a reasonable doubt, so they looked to modern technology for the answer. Today, meteorologists are able to approximate with 99% certainty what temperatures may have been in the past by running computer models through a process called reanalysis.
Reanalysis in general is an essential component of climate science. It is important to go back to those records and correct mistakes that may have been made.
Using reanalysis of the Al-Azizi location in 1922, the WMO committee can conclusively say that it was not possible for the temperature at Al-Azizia to reach 58 degrees Celsius on September 13, 1922. The holiest of weather records was proven to be false.
It's on every chart.
My whole life I grew up accepting this record.
I teach that the first night of class every semester.
It'd be like finding out that Mount Everest is not the highest mountain in the world.
Maybe there were some magical meteorological things that happened, and all of a sudden, bingo, we got the record high temperature. I think ultimately that's less interesting and less verifiable than a place that is very, very hot, not out of the ordinary.
With the decertification of the Al-Azizia record, the title of hottest temperature ever recorded on Earth returns to a reading of 134 degrees Fahrenheit at the Greenland Ranch in Death Valley, California.
Death Valley is a land of extremes. I mean, think about it. It's the hottest, driest, lowest spot in the country. 5 months out of the year, it's ungodly hot, and you want to be anywhere else but here.
We know that Death Valley is, without question, one of the hottest places on Earth.
Following his fascination with extreme weather records, Chris travels to Death Valley to experience the location that now claims the hottest temperature on Earth.
This is my first time I've ever been to Death Valley, and I never realized what an amazing place it is. It's absolutely spectacularly beautiful. As a weather tourist, it's also a very special place.
July 10th, 1913, 134 degrees was recorded here, and it was part of what we would call a record heat wave. 10 days in a row, 125 degrees or above.
It is hugely important to have a reliable record of temperatures that goes back over time.
We like things to be consistent and dependable, not just for day-to-day weather, but for decades.
As a scientific community, we should be able to have confidence in those records.
So that we can understand the changes that are going on in the climate right now.
Oscar Denton was the caretaker here at what was then the Greenland Ranch, and he said it was so hot that a flock of swallows fell dead to the ground. He said it was so hot that when he went out to measure the temperature, he wrapped a wet Turkish towel around his head, walked out to take the temperature, walked back, and that towel was already dry. There was an ungodly hot wind blowing, but it pushed the temperature 5 degrees higher than the day before. The day before had been 129, which is hot enough. But that one hottest day, it was 134.
With questions from the Al-Azizia record still weighing on his mind, Chris works with Wilderness Coordinator Charlie Callaghan at Death Valley National Park to investigate the record-setting temperature and to discover its credibility. Chris visits the Death Valley archives to view what was the source of greatest scrutiny in the Al-Azizia record, the original handwritten log sheet.
And so this is the carbon copy from July 1913. This is the one that Oscar Denton was recording, and there's his signature. So he was the caretaker of Greenland Ranch. And we can see that it didn't start off real hot in July, 117, but then boy did it move up. 134, 129, 130, 131. And that's the end of the real hot streak. And so it's interesting, it's not one single day.
7 days of exceptional heat, and it cools closer to normal levels here. And so that leads me to believe that it's authentic.
It's consistent. It met the Weather Service standards. You had a trained observer who had been doing it for an extended period, very meticulous in doing it.
So we know it wasn't a typographical error.
Here in Death Valley today, we still have an official weather station. It's maybe a quarter mile different than where the one was in 1913, but we're still right here in the valley floor.
Although the original weather station from 1913 is no longer in operation, Charlie shows Chris the National Park's official weather station, where temperatures as high as 129 degrees have been recorded within the last decade. Armed with archival photos of the original weather station, they then search for the nearby location that now claims to be the hottest spot on Earth.
So I've got some photos here of the original weather station, and these are taken in the early 1900s. And now that's amazing. Look at this one, and look at the line on the mountains there. You see those little humps there? Look at here. See these 2, 3 humps?
Right.
The exact same 3 that we see there. So we're very close in the vicinity. And then the other photo we have is a picture of the orchard, and look at this. These are the small date palms planted in the early 1920s, but the taller trees are fan palms. And if we look here, there is a fan palm that was here also in the 1920s. So we're very close to standing in the spot of that original weather station.
Shelter.
It looks like a standard National Weather Service louvered, covered, you know, station.
Here we are, the hottest place on the planet. Just amazing.
If we would have been here in July 10th, 1913.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm far more convinced after this visit to Death Valley that this was a legitimate reading in 1913. There's a big difference between the evidence for the Azizia record compared to the evidence for the Greenland Ranch record. Almost overwhelming circumstantial evidence in favor of the record.
There's a big difference between first and second, and having to authoritatively be able to say this is the hottest spot on Earth, at least as recorded temperatures, is a big plus.
How hot can it actually get on our planet? There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that this record will be broken.
Today we're breaking twice as many high temperature records as we are low temperature records.
I wouldn't be surprised if we hit 130 or 131. But for the conditions for 134 to happen again, probably not in my lifetime.
Will the record be broken with rising temperatures, or will the conditions necessary for the Earth to reach such extreme temperatures never fall into place again? And where should scientists look in search of that record-breaking temperature reading? Will it happen again in Death Valley, or will it be somewhere else?